Like a potato straight out of the 1990s, through to a modern and elegant simulation. Today we'll put it to the test against a 4090, the best graphics card money can buy, to see whether Cities Skylines 2 can actually be played. Please consider subscribing and say a little prayer for my wallet, and let's jump straight into the video. We'll be running 12 tests throughout this video, and the first ones will largely run off the recommended settings. For the most part, of course, we'll fiddle with the graphics quality a little bit, but we will use this guide from Paradox, particularly when it comes to the depth of field. I'll be turning motion blur off for the most part as well, though it won't be entirely relevant. Anyway, without any further ado, there is but one more thing to cover, and that is, of course, the system itself. Running an RTX 4090 is the graphics card, a powerful Intel 12th generation, granted not the most recent, i9 12900KF, as well as a reasonable solid-state drive and 64 gigs of RAM. Let's take a look. Firstly, we're starting on very low graphics settings at the recommended 1080p 60Hz refresh rate. Now, what we'll do is we'll take about 15 seconds on each one, and these first tests, by the way, are ran at a simple simulation, like you might do if you just want to watch your city tick by. One speed, back at a distance, of course, looking at a big city of roughly 55,000 population every time. Now let's move through to the low graphics settings, where nothing else will change except we're going from very low to low. And here you'll notice maybe a little bit of a difference compared to last time. Shadows looking slightly more defined. Distances as well, another big win. You can actually see what that smokestack is in the background instead of just some mysterious smoke. But what are these upgrades actually costing us? Well, as we can see, obviously a little bit of extra pressure on the system across the board, but the frames per second have dropped significantly, actually, at a sitting still space here around 15. Now moving through to medium, this is the second from the top, the second best graphics setting in Cities Skylines 2, high of course being the best one that you can get. And here, again, as you might expect, a noticeable improvement, particularly around shadows, detail at a distance now too. We can start to see some of the distant suburbs actually looking like they have houses in them instead of just being distant blobs. Outside of that, you'll notice that the frame rate drops, but not as much as last time. Pressure on the system roughly the same. We've maybe lost around 7 or 8 frames per second, still above the target. Now moving through to the final category, high. This is as good as you can get, 1080p, 60 frames per second, and yet again, the quality has improved. Though, personally, and this might just be me, of course I'd love your feedback below, not as much of an improvement as maybe the time before, or the time before that even. Frames per second wise, we're down at around 40. And that brings us to the end of our first packet of testing. 4 tests at 1080p from very low to high, and here you can see the average frame rate for us sitting still, observing a city of roughly 50,000 people, and at one speed. Now let's take a look at something just slightly different. This is very low at 1440p, the native resolution of my monitor, obviously a significant improvement to the resolution, and you'll notice that straight away. It almost looks like a completely different game actually. Running at native resolution, we also don't really notice a drop in frames. If anything, we're actually pushing slightly better, though that could well fall within the margin of error. Now, as a quick side-by-side, here you can see on the left, 1080p, and on the right, 1440p. Again, my native resolution, much better at displaying those details, particularly on the buildings, their defined edges, much more noteworthy. You're probably not looking to play on very low though, so let's move through and take a look at low. Again, 1440p. And a 120Hz monitor, not that we'll necessarily be seeing anything like that. Now, when you see maybe the cars moving around in the foreground of the screen, or just the extra detail and shadows in the distance, I think you can see this is a worthwhile upgrade. Frames per second wise, not quite pushing 60 here on the RTX 4090, just shy of that. Moving through to medium, maybe a more sort of happy middle ground for people to play on. And at 1440p, it's looking great. Honestly, this looks really good. Even at a distance, lots of stuff is rendering. I would note that the difference between low and medium, again, not that significant. at least when we compare it to the jump from very low to low, and we'll look at them all at the end, around 45 to 50 frames per second. And now finally, high, at 1440p, 120 Hz, again, still sitting still, just watching and observing a city play out, trying to get a feel for it, the living and hopefully breathing world. Here you can see the detail is obviously top-notch, about as good as you can get unless you're playing around in photo mode or what have you, and we're pulling around 40 frames per second. Our worst result, but roughly on par with what we were getting again at that lower resolution, 1080p. Before looking at those results, we should look at one other thing. I'm sure many people will request it. This is the potato, the lowest that the resolution can go, 480p and very low global graphics quality. This is obviously not a very desirable state. The 1990s called and it wants its SimCity back, although you will pull impressive frame rates here, finally pushing up to 85. Can't quite get to a 90, but there you have it, everybody. If you're willing to sacrifice everything for frames per second and sit still and watch a big city, that's roughly what you can get out of it. Now, moving away from that though, let's focus back in on something that has a much better resolution, those 1440p results. And how did we go? Well, surprisingly, at the lower end, actually a little bit better than 1080p. But by and large, and I think considering this is not a scientific test and allowing a little bit of a margin for error, the results broadly similar, between 70 and 40 frames per second. My conclusion? Resolution, at least from this section, seems to have very little impact on overall frame rate. But what if you're actually playing the game? Let's move on to 4 stress tests and different levels as I move and build, playing the game at 3 speed, the top speed, in dynamic weather settings. We'll start with a very low test at 1080p. So it's the recommended resolution and, broadly speaking, the recommended graphics settings, although of course we've got everything on low. And as you can see from the few clips that I've pulled together here, FPS varies a lot. Particularly moving into the city, you'll see it drop easily below 30 FPS. Again, on 1080p, very low graphics settings. It does, however, average around 50, give or take. For the next test, let's see how it does on 1080p at high settings. This is maximum graphical output at a reduced resolution. Again, a reminder, this is the 4090 graphics card. And as we can see, again, it struggles, dropping slightly below where it did in the previous test, but more importantly, it averages a much lower FPS. It is consistently was, say, at the previous test, down consistently below 30 frames per second. With averages being drawn down by spikes, it comes out at around 30. Now, onto a bigger test. This is 1440p, but very low graphics settings. This is it in its ideal state for my monitor and my computer, though of course, very low. And we can see that the resolution here does have maybe a little bit of an impact. The system broadly manages about 45 frames per second on very low settings, struggling again, hitching in places a lot. And finally, the big test. How does it go at maximum graphics settings, 1440p? Well, as you might expect, it looks great, even on a gloomy, rainy day, but it does struggle, barely holding on to a 30 frame per second average. This is it put to its absolute limit, and it struggles to hold up. If you're sitting still, looking at a spot, maybe designing a small area, you won't worry too much. But placing things down, placing buildings in particular, and obviously as you move around the world, you'll notice a lot of trouble. It is perhaps most important to note that this is not the best system money can buy, but it is arguably right up there at the top tier. And the pressure on my CPU throughout these tests has been strangely low, almost never getting above 10%. It's the GPU that's handling most stuff here, and of course, the RAM. And so, our final results for the stress test come in at something like this. Now again, these are of course pretty rough averages, and this is not a scientific test, but it does seem as though the 4090 is capable just of producing an average of 30 frames per second in Cities Skylines 2. This is of course just the testing of one man on the internet with but one system. I was also recording, of course, this footage, though I would note that recording barely has an impact on my frame rate most of the time. And of course, the entire footage was recorded, so at least that is consistent throughout. I wouldn't predict I'd drop more than 2 or 3 frames per second by recording. At least that's my experience in this and most other games, to be fair. The other thing to note is that some of the micro hitching or the micro drops in frame rate aren't very well picked up in this test, this relatively rudimentary test. Granted. So what I mean by that is if a frame is dropped just for a split second, the whole game kind of hitches as you move across the world. That might not be picked up very well in a 60-second rolling average, though of course, the more it happens, the more likely it is to be picked up. Overall, I think that the 4090 barely performs at expected level. Colossal Order have said that they target 30 frames per second for a city builder like this because you don't really need the fast refresh rate that you might need in a multiplayer shooter, and I think that that's fair enough, though not overly ambitious. Although as we've seen, in the current state of Cities Skylines 2, even one of the very best systems with the best graphics card money can buy can barely run this puppy at 30 frames per second. Let me know your experience below. It does vary a lot by system. I'd love to hear your feedback. It's been great so far, and I'll see you all next time.